Okay, I think we're going to make a start. Welcome everyone online. I don't know where they are. I presume they're up over there. Welcome to you, all of you who are online, and to those of you who are in the room. I'm Scott Netherskull. I'm from University, and I'm substituting, if you like, for the home team who, for various reasons, are not here this evening. But I'm, of course, not here to talk about myself, but rather to introduce our speaker this evening, Jesús Rodríguez Viejo, who is an assistant professor in art history and material culture at the University of Groningen, and has been here for the last 5 years. Only 3 months at NIKI, yes. He took his PhD in 2019 at the University of Edinburgh with a thesis entitled Manuscript Illuminations of Gullen in the 11th century, which, as its title suggests, looks at the production of manuscripts in this very, very famous site during a period of particular crisis. You have published in both individually, widely in numerous journals since 2013, including the Journal of Ecclesiastical History, or the Journal of Religious History, and you've also published in collective volumes as part of international projects and research networks, such as the British Archaeological Association, about the Romanesque, right? And Episcopus, a part of about the power of bishops, and that came out this year, right? In January. His research interests, he's a medievalist, as I'm sure you realize, and his research interest stretches across material culture, so from manuscripts to liturgical objects, and it tends to be focused on Western Europe, and brings to the whole range of different issues, from performance and urban history to materiality and environmental humanities, broader social issues around otherness, conflict, and multiculturalism. During his stay here at the NIKI, he has been working on a monograph on objects and materials of the Norman world, analyzing material culture production in the long 12th century in Normandy, in England, and especially in Norman Sicily, with a particular focus, as I understand it, on users, meanings, and their environments. So, I presume it's out of that we're going to hear from you this evening in a talk that, again, as I understand, will focus on materials that have largely been overlooked in the history of medieval Sicily. So, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you everyone for coming. We'll just set up a timer so I know more or less where I stand. And thank you so much, Lex and Michael, if you're from home, and Christian and Ilaria, and of course Emma is also not here, but still, thank you so much for having me for the past 3 months. It's been an incredible experience, and it's also, I was saying before, that it's like my first experience just doing research abroad since my PhD, I guess. So this has been wonderful. Talking of which, this was not part of my PhD. This comes back to my master's thesis. I'm going to show you a few slides as an introduction. So all of you can see here today is mostly work in progress. So I'm super open to feedback and any thoughts, any ideas in terms of methodology. Everything is quite open and can be a bit more like anthropological in terms of how people feel about objects. So everything is quite open to feedback and people's thoughts as well. For the topic itself, working there as well. The fact that I also applied for this period here in Florence is also because there's a number of objects from Norman Sicily from the 12th century in Tuscany, especially in Florence, but also in Siena, for instance. So these 3 months, of course, allowed me to also, of course, get closer to these objects. You're going to see that for many reasons, these objects have been forgotten. There are very few images online, for instance, very few details, not lots of information online. So sometimes it's actually just so much better to just go to the place in which these objects are. As a teacher in Groningen, I'm literally obsessed with this idea of using objects, sometimes really random objects with a function, like this flask that is saving the day today in this heat, with this idea of how can we understand objects, not necessarily, for instance, paintings or fine art, sculpture. How can we understand historical objects today in two contexts, of course, first and foremost for me in the classroom, with the students from our bachelors of arts and in the masters and the minor as well in Groningen, but also many of these students in turn are becoming curators, especially in the Netherlands, but also abroad, and they are dealing with objects. So how can we use this material culture, these objects, from these two points of view? I'm gonna just click here, yes, change it, just to get rid of that. After that, it's mostly about history for me. It's essentially how can we understand medieval history from the point of view of objects, especially the people surrounding these objects. And after that, the world surrounding these people and these objects in the Middle Ages. So essentially more of a historical perspective on these subjects. And essentially from that point of view, how can we know more about the world they live in, and what lessons, what can we learn today from this study of the Middle Ages as well. This, I think, is really important in the case of the Netherlands and in our masters in art history and curatorial studies, essentially because the Netherlands, and unlike many institutions in other countries in Europe, they have vast collections of objects, especially in the case of the Netherlands, of ceramics, such as is the case of the Groningen Museum, which has one of the largest collections of ancient ceramics in the world, but it's also, of course, the case of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, especially for the late Middle Ages and the early modern periods. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of objects, just a score like a few hundred paintings. So, of course, in terms of relationship, in terms of numbers, objects, there are just so many more objects, and yet we know very little about them. And we also like sometimes as our historians the tools to approach objects, let's say from the Middle Ages, but also from the early modern period. Even, of course, if we understand to some extent that objects have a function and we can relate to some extent to that function, we still lack methodological approaches to these subjects. So I'm going to discuss this as well in the case of the Middle Ages in Sicily. And why Sicily? Because I'm from Spain, but also living in the Netherlands. I'm studying Sicily, South Italy, more widely also Naples and other places in South Italy, but in this specific case, the island of Sicily. What I'm taking here a look at essentially first and foremost at materials, like the materials used in these objects, the composite materials, to some extent also to the peoples. This is going to be relevant in some cases for a reason that I'm going to explain later, why the makers are also relevant, because we have makers essentially divided by religion, and it's very unique in medieval Sicily. Essentially lots of Muslims, but also lots of Greek Orthodox Byzantines also working with different materials. I'm going to explain that later. By extension, after we have an object, I normally look at the people surrounding, normally the owners of these objects. After that, also the presence of the objects. So where are these objects and where are these people? In this particular case of medieval Sicily, so specific physical places, to some extent, of course, preserved today for the most part, maybe change over time, over the centuries, but for the most part, we can visualize to some extent these physical settings as well. And from that point of view, but also with this idea of physical setting, but going back to the materials, I also take a look at the natural world. So essentially, what's the relationship between man and nature in the Middle Ages through the point of view of this object, both in terms of materials, and especially extraction of these objects, especially in case of rocks or minerals, but also, of course, with the actual function of this object in a specific case. And of course, I'm gonna use examples from medieval Sicily to illustrate all these different relationships here as well. And last but not least, this idea of globalization before modern globalizations, especially before the early modern period, before the modern period at large, especially in the case of the Mediterranean, tracing relationships using objects, especially it's going to be the case of rock crystal, that is going to be the first material that I'm going to talk about, and the case of how objects and materials before them, they move from different regions, from different countries, in this case, in the medieval Mediterranean. So this is what interests me regarding objects. First of all, in terms of methodology, today I'm going to discuss the concept of object biography that I use in my teaching very extensively. That is super important for especially curatorial studies, how to approach objects in collections, and how can we learn more about these objects in order to create essentially narratives that we can use for research, in my case, but also for curators, for instance, for organizing exhibitions about objects, or featuring objects, at least in exhibitions. After that, we're going to contextualize Sicily, because I understand that not necessarily is a very well-known context in our history, beyond, of course, the famous architecture, the Norman architecture in Sicily. So we're going to talk a bit about that, but also contextualizing this idea of the royal workshops in Palermo, because most of the objects that we have seen, with one exception, they are all coming from the royal workshops. So this is kind of like a very well-known, relatively well-known setting of production of manufacturing, the so-called nobles officine that we have there, essentially the royal workshops. After that, 3 case studies, 1 mineral, 1 rock, and 1 metal. The metal, however, is work in progress. So I'm going to just introduce it at the end to see essentially what I work with these 3 case studies. All of them, so I'm going to tell you already, mineral is the rock crystal, essentially quartz. Rock is jasper, and metal is copper and different copper alloys, mostly bronze. All of that, so for instance, there's no gold or ivory that are well-known materials. All of them, they have been overlooked in our history for the Middle Ages quite widely. So I'm trying to contribute to the discussion of these lesser-known objects as well, in the case of medieval Sicily as well. And after that, we're going to contextualize these different objects by talking about physical context, again, like the places they are in, and also our perception and the natural world, especially through the perception, the different senses that people back then used to see these objects and art more widely roughly in the mid-12th century, taking a look at different types of sources. We're going to take a look at that in a bit. But again, as I mentioned before, I'm from Spain. I'm working in the Netherlands, living in the Netherlands, and I'm essentially focusing on Italy for my research. This literally comes from, it's a bit random, I have to say, but it comes from first of all, from my bachelor's time in Naples, especially studying with Giovanni Coppola, which is this very important figure for the study of Norman architecture in South Italy. He's an architect. And also after that, for my master's background, in which I chose this object, this manuscript, you can see there part of it, the Psalter, back then it was called the Fecamp Psalter, which is in the Royal Library in today the National Bibliothèque in The Hague, in which after that, in 2016, I published an article saying, as a result of my master's thesis, that the anonymous patronage portrait present in the manuscript, the image that you can see there, belonged to the famous first French queen, later English queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine. So you can check there as well the open access website that was created after the publication of my article, and the article itself is also available open access. So that's why I stuck with the Normans. I think, in a way, I like to talk about the Normans as this epitome of medieval history, because we have 3 very important, but at the same time quite separate, especially in the case of Sicily, of course, quite separate physical, geographical contexts in Europe today, part of 3 different countries like England, France, Normandy in France, and Sicily here in Italy, and ideas, of course, of conquest, very famously as well, state building, also very well studied, art creation, we're going to see to some extent what has been studied so far in terms of these 3 Norman worlds, and multicultural relations, applies to Normandy and England with Jewish minorities, mentioned later, but especially, of course, in the case of Sicily, which is a truly multicultural, multi-religious society, especially through the 12th century as well. Overall, I have to say as well that unlike other contexts, like, for instance, medieval Spain, early and high medieval Spain, overall official records, chronicles, everything for the most part in England, but also in Normandy and also to some extent in Sicily, everything has been published already, edited. So all these different sources, like the history of this king or this area of Palermo in the 12th century, they have been overall well studied from this historical point of view. From the art history perspective, though, overall the picture is very different because we have first and foremost architecture, Norman architecture, the beginnings of the Romanesque movement in architecture. They have received lots of attention in all three different contexts, both in Normandy, in England, but also in Sicily. Not so much about objects, and thus, of course, the point of my book project is to talk about these forgotten objects, like, for instance, manuscripts, like the Kamsalter, but also reliquaries, for instance, that I have published about. For the most part, objects have been itemized, they appear in catalogs, they have been described, compared, but little else beyond this traditional approach to objects. The only exception being, for instance, the regalia of King Roger II of Sicily that are today in Vienna, that I'm going to mention before. They're in Vienna, they are associated with a king, like King Roger II. Therefore, they have attracted lots of academic attention, but is the exception to the rule. Normally, usually, like, objects don't attract lots of attention in Italy, in France, or even in England. This is an overview of the Kamsalter with the double page composition. It was the core of my master thesis back then in Leiden, hence that I discovered this manuscript. And yeah, it's been quite a journey since then. This was from almost like 15 years ago. So literally discovering this manuscript in a way changed my life, because kind of I started researching something that was not really familiar for me, like Normandy, for instance, coming from Spain or from studying in South Italy. For Norman Sicily, as I mentioned before, introduced before, architecture and especially monumental decoration, mostly mosaics, like the ones you can see here from Monreale Cathedral, from Cefalù Cathedral, mosaics from Palermo, from the city of Palermo itself, like the Cappella Palatina. They have been very well studied, described, compared, analyzed within the wider Mediterranean. From traditional points of view, for over a century, there are publications in Italian from the early 20th century, so they have been quite a study. The idea is that we have, of course, in Italy, in South Italy, we have this mix of Western and Eastern Byzantine Christian mix, as I call it, from the aesthetic point of view. And that, of course, attracted the attention of so many people, for instance, like Ernst Kitzinger. People come from Austria, from Germany, traveling to Sicily and studying, plus, of course, Italian experts, and writing extensively about these mosaics. The idea also is that we have associations, direct associations between some of these settings, like Cappella Palatina, of course, but also the two cathedrals, the cathedrals of Cefalù and Monreale, direct relationships with kingship, with the ideas of kings. Essentially, in the Middle Ages, that has been something really important, this idea of patronage, of somebody, a historical figure that is very well known, and attach that idea of kingship directly to a monument, like in this case, these two cathedrals in Sicily. And of course, we don't know much about everything else, like objects, because we don't have direct patronage links. We know they were made in these royal workshops under this king or that king, but we don't have a direct relationship of news or no inscriptions to relate these objects to these different kings. And of course, no authorship, like later on in the early modern period, because simply we don't know the names of all these different artists and artisans that were involved in the production of these objects. I have to say that Norman arts in general, here separating between Normandy and England in the 12th century and South Italy, they have undergone this different, how to say this, a wave of interest in recent years with the publication of these specific books. The Invention of Norman Visual Culture by Lisa Rayleigh, I think from 2020, and Designing Norman Sicily, Material Culture and Society, edited volume by Emily Boncoder, I think from 2021, 2022, if I remember correctly. The problem, though, for me is that in what it is, the invention of Norman visual culture, there, essentially, there's one chapter on Sicily, but it's essentially focusing on Normandy and England. And it focuses actually on the idea of the creation of architecture. So how, like, architects design the interiors of churches, with one exception in this whole book, which is of course the front cover, which is the Bayeux tapestry in Normandy. That's the only, more what I understand as a visual culture there. And of course, this idea of dynastic ambition, always this idea of kinship, of kings, very famous kings like William II, Henry II later on, being related to the production of art, in this case of cathedrals in Normandy in England. The difference with design in Norman Sicily, this book deals a bit more with objects per se. For instance, coins, like the production of coins is a collaboration. Emily Winkler is a historian. It's a collaboration between historians and art historians. So there's a bit more of objects from Sicily, but for the most part, they focus, when it comes to objects and material culture, they focus on the regalia of Roger II, as you can see there in Vienna. There are several chapters dedicated to these regalia. They're very famous. Of course, this connection also with Roger II. They are an institution in Vienna at the center of Europe, and they left aside also smaller objects that I'm going to discuss here today. These objects, nevertheless, you see there, they were front and center, they were used, they were seen, perceived daily on a daily basis. What we are talking here for the most part are either religious contexts, so liturgical objects that were used in medieval religion, but also to some extent, like in the image that you can see there, domestic items. But of course, we're talking here about luxury domestics, so belonging to a court, roughly speaking, to the elites of the Kingdom of Sicily in the Middle Ages. So for the most part, domestic luxurious material culture, but nevertheless, objects like the one you can see there as well. Of course, in the sources, they don't appear mentioned much. In a way, my job is to find references to objects, like the ones you can see here. We're going to talk this year, they're going to talk in a bit about it. And it is also so far, what can we talk about when we discuss objects like this? Until very recently, until like almost 20 years or so, there was an overall lack of methodologies, and also in particular in countries like Italy or Spain, in which these objects were simply not studied by our historians. First of all, we need to mention that some of these objects, they are, like the majority of them, they are not in situ. They have traveled the whole world over the century. They are in different countries. For the most part, we're going to see most of these objects are in Vienna as well, where most of these collections end up in the Kunsthistorisch Museum today. They have itemized describing catalogs, nothing else. Of course, no known author, no inscriptions. We cannot apply discourses of authorship of one person, one artist that we know and we can talk about him or her. No famous patron as well, because we know this belongs to this royal environment in Palermo in the 12th century, but no direct relationship with kings, for instance, like the regalia that we mentioned before. So, and of course, in many cases, like here, you can see there, no iconography. So we can also not use these traditional iconographic approaches to material culture, like with visual culture. So what can we do? What I apply in my research and also in my teaching is the concept of object biography that has revolutionized truly since the 1990s, but especially from the 2000s on art history, especially for the Middle Ages and the early modern period. Everything started with Igor Kopytov working at Penn in the US and with his cultural biography of things. And he was followed by many other people. Also many archaeologists as well, so people that were finding historical objects, so way before the Middle Ages and antiquity and before that, and people asking themselves, what can we tell about this object that we have found, and how can we create a narrative that allows us to present this object to people in research, but also in museum collections and exhibitions as well. Kopytov's idea here was essentially to understand the object as a living being, so it's a person with a birth, with a life, and also with a death. So death is essentially what he called the afterlife, which essentially means a destruction or a reuse. So essentially something changing after a certain time, after the object is created, and that will become the death, essentially an afterlife of the object as well. Plus, in between, since the making and this afterlife, all the different relationships that objects have had with the people. Of course, the makers first and foremost, but also the users, the owners, and the people that came, normally owners as well, that came after that, normally many years after the object was created. The idea of Kopytov here is that these relationships, they change the whole time. The object is not the same and the object is influencing the people surrounding them at different moments, but also being influenced by them. So for instance, like losing parts, adding parts, meanings, changing the meaning, something that was in the Middle Ages was something, then later on became something else as well. In my case, as I mentioned before, we mentioned materials and use, that kind of like this thing that appeals to me, especially different materials and how they are used as well. I used to be more interested into performance as well, a bit less so, but still I keep this idea of performativity as well in my research, especially performativity understood as religious performance, kind of like liturgical performance as well. And after that, also very closely related to it, sensorial perception, so like the role of the senses and especially the relationship with materials and how essentially people perceive materials and objects in the Middle Ages as well. And after that, more recently, I've been developing from this idea of perception, but also materials, relationships with the natural world, so essentially with the environment. Where are these materials coming from? How they are reflecting, for instance, changes in the environment, in the places they are located. We're going to see all of that using a few examples from Palermo in the 12th century. The potential of the object biography is huge, because the idea is that we are moving from catalogs that very few people honestly read to applying this methodology to museum displays and, of course, in my case, classrooms. So essentially making, in my case, the Middle Ages more understandable, more accessible to people, especially for students as well. Very important too that this is also multidisciplinary in nature, because for the most part, in my case, I'm talking mostly to archaeologists and to historians than actual art historians. So it's kind of like the methodology fosters collaboration between different people. The idea is that an object, again, kind of like allows us to approach it in a very natural way, normally through function, but can be through material as well, through the making, but mostly through function. So this idea of quickly, immediately realizing the function of an object really makes it way more accessible as well. And as part of this recent development, we have this new series by Routledge, the so-called Encounters and 50 Objects, who essentially analyze different historical periods. There are 3 volumes out there, mostly the result of collaborations between, again, historians, art historians, and archaeologists working together. For instance, the medieval economy, so using objects that will not really gather much attention in a museum context, but trying to explain the medieval economy through the preservation of some of these objects. So you can imagine many of them from the late Middle Ages here in Italy, in places like Siena, as well for the Islamic Age world and the Crusades. So essentially not relying exclusively on textual sources. So using these objects that, again, people can understand quite easily at first, using those objects. Of course, textual sources, there should always be textual sources, but making these way more accessible for people. For the Nobiles Officine, for the Royal Workshops, this is what I'm focusing on because of this catalog. You can see here a physical copy of it. Dozens of luxurious objects today in collections all over Europe. They have been catalogued, itemized, and ascribed to these royal workshops in Palermo throughout the 12th century, the beginnings of the 13th century as well, but I'm focusing mostly on the 12th century. These royal workshops were also very commonly referred to in the Arabic-speaking sources as the tiras, in reference to the work of textiles in particular that Muslims were specialists in, and also ergasteion, a place of work essentially in Greek, but in reference to the Byzantines, Greek-speaking Sicilians working in particular with metals. So metalworks, goldsmith, for instance, the work of gold, but also stones, the carving of stone. We will see some of these specific examples as well. I'm focusing a tiny bit less on ivories. I'm talking about ivories in the book a bit, but a bit less so because they have been better studied compared to other materials. The reason is that there's this huge school of so-called Southern Italian ivories from the 12th century, some of them being made in Palermo by the Nobiles Officine, but also another very important school in Salerno, near Naples. And there have been different books, and for a few decades now, on specializing in ivory as well. So I'm still trying to figure out how to deal with ivory, because I need to talk about it, but at the same time, it's not the same as talking about jasper or rock crystal, in which there's just way more room to talk about. Of course, the so-called regalia of Roger II, you can see there in the front cover of the book, part of the mantle, of the coronation mantle of King Roger II. They have attracted lots of attention to. The idea is, of course, they are in Vienna, in one of like the most important museums in the world. I mean, they have many objects in the Kunsthistorisch. The regalia are in the Hofburg, which is another institution, but nevertheless in Vienna. And of course, this relationship with kingship, with the idea of one specific historical figure, that is really important. All of these came together in this catalog that you can see here. After an exhibition in 2004, unique exhibition. I was a teenager back then. I couldn't visit Palermo back then. I would just wish I could. 2 years later, published this catalog here, essentially bringing together all these different objects that were, some of them also attributed to this kind of wider South Italian, but for the most part, objects that were like specialists thought that they were originally from these royal workshops, everything put together by Maria Andaloro, like former medieval art history professor at the University of Lattucia in Lazio. And this meant essentially that after 800 years, for the first time, dispersion all over Europe, especially, all these objects were being brought to the origin, so essentially to Palermo, after 800 years. It's a very momentous occasion for the city itself and from the region of Sicily more widely. This is the full image of the coronation mantle in the Hofburg in Vienna, that has attracted so much attention in the catalog, being the front cover of it, but also in this book by Emily, edited by Emily Winkler as well. It's mostly focusing on these objects. But I focus, of course, in smaller objects. Just to contextualize, for the 12th century, we are talking about the rules of these three kings, with most importantly of Roger II in the first half of the 12th century. As you can see there, William I, slightly less important, is way more important. Roger's grandson, William II, essentially in the second half of the 12th century. We have very close links with the church too, a very important royal patronage, because we have, of course, the Normans arriving in Sicily, mostly majority Muslim kingdom back then, the island, and establishing lots of, for instance, of small churches, monasteries, and most importantly, two cathedrals, one by Roger II, Cefalù, after 1131, and another one by his grandson William II in the second half of the 12th century, Monreale in 1174. We also have, I'm not discussing bishops here today, but I will discuss that in the case of, for instance, Richard Palmer, which was like this Englishman that became bishop at Messina and commissioned a series of manuscripts that are today in Spain, in Madrid, in the Royal Library, essentially decorated by Byzantine artists as well, even if they are Latin manuscripts as well. So I will deal with them after that. Very important for objects too, that we have a very multicultural population, mostly Latins, Normans, and the mainland, essentially Italians from the mainland, the so-called Lombards too. They are a minority, they are a ruling minority, because the majority are essentially in Sicily in the 12th century are Muslims, followed by very important minorities of Greeks and smaller minorities, especially in the cities, of Jewish people. I'll also discuss in my research conversion, the idea of conversion, of forced conversion to Christianity, and how Latins, but also Byzantines, Greeks to some extent, forced the mass conversion of Muslims and Jews, especially Muslims, to Christianity through the 12th century. As I mentioned before, for the most part, we are talking about Muslims working with ivory textiles and things like minerals like red crystal, but also wood carving, and Greeks, metalwork and stones, but also metals like gold there and silver. I'm going to mention that later on. So very unique type of historical circumstances in medieval Sicily, 12th century Sicily around this time. My first experience with Sicily actually comes from a few years ago when I published this article you can see there as well at the bottom of this slide. with this idea of performance. I was obsessed, and still obsessed to some extent, with this idea of how things that were ephemeral, something that happened, like a few hours in the Middle Ages, how can we approach that? This idea of performance, something that happened in a certain, very limited period of time, but for mostly religious performances. And in this case, I discovered, I don't remember if it was actually through this catalog or just reading online, the existence of a total of 8 cross reliquaries, essentially cross-shaped reliquaries of the Holy Cross, with relics of the true cross, all 8 of them coming from the royal workshops, from the nobles of Sicily in Palermo through the 12th century. All of them, they are not in one single institution today, so they are super dispersed, mostly in Italy, mostly in mainland Italy. There's just one that still is in Sicily. Everything else is mostly in central and southern Italy, in different small collections, plus 2 of them also being in Germany as well. Today, the idea is that these images here, these reliquaries, they were super beautiful. They have all these different, different materials. They were seemingly very important, but I also at the same time found very little information about these subjects. So essentially created through this idea of performativity, I created a methodology, a narrative to approach these objects and how to talk about these objects that were so important for the religious life of 12th century Sicily. So essentially using sources in text, chronicles, trying to find out more about their documented use in public context. So big religious ceremonies where like the handling, the showcasing of these reliquaries took place, mostly focusing on the second half of the 12th century. For the most part, what I did also go to archaeological surveys and try to figure out how Palermo in particular looked like in the second half of the 12th century in terms of mostly for the most part looking at liturgical evidence, so processions, benedictions, some of them in Italy, some of them also abroad, like Vatican as well, in Spain, and trying to figure out how processions took place, very important large processions took place in Palermo in the second half of the 12th century, just to imagine. And of course, also looking for evidence for the presence of these crosses. For instance, I studied one document, this ordinance, this processional ordinance in Madrid, describing the wedding of William II, this king of Sicily, to Joanna of England in 1177, that describes quite in detail the presence of 2 crosses that were being paraded before the groom and the bride. So it's essentially describing the hierarchy of the procession and where is this procession going. For instance, like the wedding is taking place at Palermo Cathedral, and where is it going from there? So I do that in this article. I also study some visual evidence too, so looking for, as you can see there in the altar, for very, very few testimonies of the representation of objects in 12th century Sicily. There are very few frescoes and, for instance, illuminated manuscripts like this one here, but there are some images. You can see there this presence of a crucifix there on top of the high altar of the Capella Palatina. Other types of evidence that I also use in this article, and I kept using for my research as well, for instance, these quadrilingual tombstones, so like a tombstone for like a grave of somebody, in this case, Anna, the mother of a priest, Chrysandus from Palermo, 1149, and very important too, of course, in Hebrew, in Latin, in Arabic, and in Greek. And very interestingly, in the Greek section, it is described how, for instance, Catholics and Greek Orthodox are doing processions together. That's also very, very influential. They are trying to convert Muslims, especially Muslims are the majority, especially in villages of the center of Sicily, outside of the cities. In many cases, they are opposing the rule of the Normans. So the church is really obsessed with the mass conversion of Muslims to Christianity, essentially to integrate into Norman society as well. Once this physical setting, then I also understand the idea of performativity, essentially as trying to figure it out how people felt about seeing this type of very beautiful, very expensive objects, with the idea also that we are talking here about reliquaries. So they have relics. For Christians, medieval Christians, it's such a big deal to interact with a relic, in this case from the true cross, from crucifixion, so kind of like a very big deal for the Middle Ages as well. This is something I study in Iberia. Very important too, the cult of saints, the idea of reliquaries. I'm less focused now on that for the book, but I will deal with that because with minorities like Jewish minorities, but also mostly majorities in many cases like southern Spain or Sicily, and many of these relic and cult of saints, they have overtly anti-Semitic and Islamophobic undertones to these different cults. Like they were always like celebrating the conversions, sometimes also the killings of some of these minorities. In some cases, it's kind of like a very gruesome story with lessons for today, unfortunately. But let's talk about materials and rock crystal, very beautiful things. This case, rock crystal, you may know it as quartz. Rock crystal is the name. It's kind of like the most beautiful quartz, a very good quality type of quartz that has been used since antiquity, very famous also in ancient Egypt, but also in Roman times, here in Italy, for instance, for jewelry, small statues, kind of like small objects that were being carved in rock crystal. The idea, of course, the most important aspect is transparency, because you can see into it, you can see through it, and also the idea, as we'll see later, of light reflection, of light reflecting to the rock crystal, and that kind of like appeal to people as well. From a technical point of view, rock crystal is relatively easy to carve compared to other stones and other minerals, so that also facilitated the work of this mineral. For the Middle Ages, we have lots of use as also reliquary, of course, because you're putting things inside, relics inside, but you are seeing them. So they are protected, but they are portable. They are usually small reliquaries, but at the same time, people can see the relics, the things inside the reliquary. So that's also very important. I'm going to show you later some examples. It's also something very important for medieval Christians as well. For the most part, for Sicily, this quartz is not being extracted in Sicily itself or in South Italy. It's coming from Fatimid Egypt, from the other side of the Mediterranean. Normally from this place, there are different places, but the most important place is this so-called Crystal Mountain, an area in the middle of it, right in the geographical center of Egypt, where these formations of quartz, they are coming to the ground. I'm going to show you an image after that. So some of these small pieces of quartz, they are being shipped from Alexandria to the ports of Eastern Sicily. Traded there was lots of trade, and also studying now kind of trade between the Christian Sicilians and Fatimid Egypt as well. And in 2016, also very important too, first time that somebody decided to study rock crystal, in this case, Jahan and Abinon Shalem, seeking transparency for the study of rock crystal in the Middle Ages. However, there's not a single chapter in this book dedicated to these different examples that I'm going to show you some of them now. So we have clearly. This is an image of the Crystal Mountain in Egypt. It's a huge area. I think it's like 36, 37 square kilometers cover all formations or crystal formations like this one. So it's actually in the Middle Ages, also in antiquity. People just used these different sections of rock crystal to take the largest ones and shipped it to the cities, to Cairo, to Alexandria, and some of them being also shipped to Sicily for the work there as well. The type of rock crystal that we have in Sicily, there's just like 4 or 5 examples. All of them are either in the Kunsthistorisch Museum in Vienna or in the Cathedral of Capua, or Santa Maria Capua Vetere near Naples in Campania, where some of these objects end up with. The first ones in the first half of the 12th century and the earlier second, they are normally small flasks like this that were carved with vegetable decoration, coming directly, most likely from Egypt, and they were most likely perfume containers that were used, kind of like brought directly from Egypt, from Cairo, and then the rock crystal was so precious in Sicily in the first half of the 12th century, they were later reused as reliquaries. This is something that happens as well with glass in Spain, where like wealthy people, Christians in northern Spain, they bought a perfume from the south, from Islamic Spain. They came in glass, and then once the perfume runs out, it's so precious glass in barbaric northern Spain for Christians in the north of Spain that they actually use it. They broke the flask and they put relics inside and donate it to the church, to their local church. And this is very common in Catalonia, for instance, in Spain as well. There's a shift, though, in the use of rock crystal, which happens in the second half of the 12th century, which is the appearance of these local manufacturers. So no more flasks imported for perfume from Egypt, but we actually have rock crystal, like chunks of quartz, being brought from Egypt and used for the creation of mostly ewers, jugs, like, for instance, essentially big mugs, big vases, big glasses, like this tanker that you can see here. Of course, the mountain, everything is early modern, but the core object in rock crystal is from Palermo, from the second half of the 12th century. The idea for experts, though, is that things like the one here, so essentially ewers like this one here that have decoration, they are coming from Egypt. They are original Fatimid examples. Normally, as you can see, they're slightly earlier, from the 11th century. If you have something way simpler like this, no figuration carved, like much linear surfaces like the ones here, it's made in the royal workshops in Palermo. So essentially, and we'll go back to this image that I showed you earlier, this rock crystal ewer for water, for wine, that it later became a reliquary of Santa Anastasia that is today in the Basilica of San Lorenzo here in Florence. I go back to these different set of questions, essentially going, what's the material coming from? So we have seen some of it is coming from Egypt as well. What's the context for that extraction, especially in the case of rocks and minerals? We'll discuss also later jasper as well. What do we know about the makers? How do they work? I'm slightly less concerned about technical art history in this particular case and just doing offering. In the case of rock crystal, very little is known as well, even about Fatimid Egypt. I have very little information about this more technical part. So I focus mostly on these, essentially on the functions, uses, and the different physical contexts for these objects as well. So for instance, you have to be really open-minded. I kind of think a bit outside of the box when you're trying to figure out more about objects like these rock crystal ewers from Palermo from the 12th century. In my case, I'm using lots of wasp poetry, so Arabic language poetry, in many cases written in Palermo throughout the 12th century, because of course most of the references we have on objects are inventories, like church inventories, but they are normally much later. So I'm looking at poetry, Arabic poetry, because this type of poetry, it talks a lot about the natural world, daily life. Also in the case where feasts, receptions, kind of like social life as well in Palermo around this time, gardens, lots of gardens too. So it's in this context in which I find lots of information about objects and their reception. So from this very specific point of view as well. At the same time, also talks, different natural elements like wind, water, sunlight, animals. All of that appears in Arabic poetry, and for instance, not in Christian chronicles that are way more descriptive, of the official things, the king, the church, and so on. So you need to think a bit outside of the box when dealing with 45 minutes. Bear with me. For instance, in Arabic sources like wasp poetry, lots of references to ewer, including to rock crystal ewer, also metal ewer, to be honest. Normally, ewers are associated with moments of social history, social events, but also, for instance, with in the words of Arabic poets, youthfulness and also flirtatious relationship between normally man and woman, drinking, of course. Lots of references of these keywords recalling gazelles, like the animal. It's also very prevalent in mosaics in the Islamic world. Also in Sicily, this image of especially lions and gazelles, and normally the lion is the man and the gazelle in this case is the woman. And also the keywords recall the woman for these Arabic poems as well. And of course, there's talk mentioned now. The contents, normally wine, but in some cases also just water in these ewers as well. And lots of very interesting references to water, to like the content of these ewers as being silver. So essentially water as silver, as something, water being very precious. We're going to talk about that in a bit as well. The other object is the fountain spout, essentially like the part coming out of the fountain. You can see here on the water coming out of out of it. It's today in Germany, and it's believed to have been the spout of this fountain hall in La Sisa, this royal pavilion that you can visit still today in the city center of Palermo, that I'm going to show you in a bit. So the idea this was kind of like implanted, inserted into the wall, and water will come out of this rock crystal fountain spout. There will be a total of 5 smaller orifices, kind of like little holes there. You can see 4 there, other than the eyes, and a 5th that is actually here. You cannot really see it from this image. In the eye sockets, they used to be like sapphires or some type of precious stone there. So it was a really beautiful and luxurious type of object, even if the function was essentially to, just sprinkle water from the wall into the fountain as well. We have one particular example of this type of arrangement, but not in rock crystal, but in porphyry, in red porphyry, with this Venetian fountain. Most likely Venetians probably debated the origin from 1250 today in the Dayton Museum of Art in Ohio, in the US, with the idea of the fountain spout there in red, but also a lion head, just in a different material, and the water coming out of it. So this will be the same type of arrangement that we will have seen in Palermo in the 12th century in this pavilion, in La Sisa pavilion. The idea here, just like with the poetry, the Arabic poetry that we saw before, all of these contexts are royal contexts. The palace, Palazzo dei Normandy, that is another building, but for the most part, leisure, like non-official, more relaxed type of settings in royal Palermo. So essentially the daily life, the more relaxed aspects of royal life in Palermo. In this case, it was a hunting pavilion at the center of a massive park, the Genoard Park, built in the second half of the 12th century. Of course, also take into account that all of these will be surrounded, not today, today is in the city center of Palermo, surrounded by the city, but back then was in the middle of a park with different gardens, with different fountains, also animals. It would be like whole different sensorial experience surrounding this area. And at the center of that, we have this huge door in the middle of the pavilion. We have the fountain hall. Essentially, this divided by 2. This whole area in which these, for the most part, the king was present during royal receptions of people outside of the royal palace. He will welcome guests in this hall here, as you can see, divided by these round fountain and canals, marble on the floor. The idea is that these rock crystal fountains found today in Germany once will have been located at the center of this whole context. The areas you can see there in the frescoes and a bit of like the state of preservation of the whole area, it has changed a lot, especially through the early modern period. So we cannot really figure out how it looked like 100%, but just to show you how this little piece of rock crystal once was located there as well. Lots of references also in the sources from this period, including from Palermo in the 12th century, to this very close relationship between rock crystal and water. And the idea is that water is constantly referred to as silver, as like having some type of metallic quality as well. I have analyzed this, but also taken a look at the environment of Palermo, so essentially trying to figure out how the climate and the nature of water was in the 12th century. The idea is that if we look at the sources, we find out that there's lots of problems with the availability of water in Palermo around this time. We have infrastructure from the Arabic period, from the Islamic period, before the Normans, really struggling, and the new Christian kings constructing massive parks with lots of fountains everywhere, like the Favara de Mare Dolce Lake, demanding lots of water, of the available water from Palermo that normally is dedicated to agriculture, that is now being taken to these different types of ponds, of artificial lakes for royal recreation, resulting in problems with the availability of water around this time, plus climate change around this time, much drier period. There are total these 2 studies that I consulted with different dates, but essentially in the 12th century, Palermo was super dry. Water was not very available, and on top of that, we have these Christian kings diverting water for the people to take it to these royal complexes and lakes and ponds. So the idea of water as being really, really important. Even if this dry period peaked in the 16th century, so towards the change to the early modern period, this is coming back literally over the past few decades, with some of the worst droughts being recorded in the history of Sicily since precisely the end of the Middle Ages as well. So this is also a very important matter as well. Very quickly, just to keep it within 1 hour, I'm also dealing with jasper. This is the rock that I was mentioned before. Unlike rock crystal, jasper is being extracted regionally, locally sometimes, so within the island of Sicily and surroundings of Palermo as well. Very important too, that the idea of jasper is also recalls the use, especially in imperial times, in Roman times, of red porphyry, this rock from Egypt as well, that is super precious, is being used in sarcophagi in late antiquity, so it's a big deal. Also for, as you can see there, for the Norman kings. So for instance, the sarcophagus of Roger II. Roger II was very keen on reusing red porphyry. So of course, jasper offered this idea of being similar to red porphyry, these associations with the luxurious red porphyry, but at the same time, in a more religious sense, for the Middle Ages, this idea of red jasper also recalled blood in general. And we have different sources, Pliny the Elder for Roman times, San Isidore and Bede for later medieval times, Christian authors talking about how jasper, for instance, protects against evil eye, it protects during childbirth, but also most importantly for San Isidore and Bede, it's also of course recalls the idea of blood, and most importantly the blood of Christ during the communion in particular. We have, for instance, this Byzantine chalice that is not from Palermo, but is contemporaneously more or less with this idea, especially for Greek Christianity, for Greek speakers, Greek Orthodox people, this idea of relating jasper to blood. And in the case of Palermo, in the case of Sicily, in the 12th century, we have this portable altar. Unfortunately, I haven't managed to find out good resolution pics online, but for instance, we have really nice image in the catalog here of this image here. So you can see there is the same object with essentially with a jasper core. So the center there is a wooden frame, but the center of the object is an agate jasper. Essentially, the nodules, so you can see here, the nodules of the rock, these parts of mineral within the rock, they recall blood stains. And if we think that this is a portable altar, so essentially it was to perform for a priest or a bishop to perform the communion on top like this, that kind of like gets, you can easily understand the symbolism of having this idea of blood stains on top of a communion altar. From the social point of view, this is super interesting because this was a gift from the Agrigento bishop. This was a bishopric that was established soon after the Norman takeover of Sicily in a Muslim majority area. So this idea of the state and the church working together to convert as soon as possible Muslims to Christianity, because they were rebelling against the state and they have to be converted. This also allows me to also talk about extractivism a tiny bit more, because we are talking about a mineral, a rock that is being extracted locally and regionally, essentially to talk about the slavery, the people extracting this jasper. In the case of the Norman period, this was mostly slave workforce, and by extension, mostly majority Muslim slave force that the Normans enslaved. This was normally rebel prisoners from anti-Norman rebellions, because the Muslim in the villages, especially of central Sicily, they were rebelling the whole time about the Normans in the cities, but also pogroms, like for instance in these two coups against the monarchy, many Christians massacred and enslaved Muslims that they had at hand, and also of course the Normans were also attacking parts of North Africa and bringing slaves from parts of North Africa, from what it is today Tunisia, and these were of course not trusted for being domestic slaves, so they were sent to the mines and quarries of Sicily. And this particular case, this is also very interesting to reflect, and I will finish here, about this idea of slavery in Sicily. Lots of studies about antiquity because it was very common. Some studies for the Middle Ages, not so much for the Norman period, but towards the end of the Middle Ages already during the Spanish dominion over South Italy. There are some studies on slavery, but very important too, just to discuss way more recent episodes of slavery, in this case of bondage, of children in Sicily around this time, around the year 1900. So literally very recently, in what became a very important part of the economy of the island around this period, which is sulfur, the mining of sulfur. And we have some images here. So essentially, these were children that were asked to work in mines, in sulfur mines, for the family to receive money, sometimes also in advance for the work of the children, but the children didn't get paid. And I just left you there a reportage of some of on YouTube of some of these testimonies of some of the oldest, the last surviving Carusi from Sicily. This is from the year 2000 now. I suppose they are all dead, but just to talk about it and how important this message it is. And I believe, and I promise you, this is the last slide. It's not, there are conclusions, but I believe this is the last slide. Just what I'm doing at the moment, and it's just to talk about copper and bronze in general, but all types of copper alloys. Of course, the idea here is that copper and bronze, more specifically, they were not considered of a lot of value. No, it's not gold or silver. So the idea is that were melted and recut the whole time. And this is, for instance, the premise of very important books by Reid, for instance, and also one article by Robin Reich on Sicily, dealing with the most important examples of bronze from the Middle Ages that we have today, which are monumental bronze doors for cathedrals in particular and churches. We have very little smaller objects. I found in Siena, in a private collection, I found this small, you have the height there, is 15 centimeters tall, these situla, so essentially this cauldron for the blessing with water of spaces and people, like crowds, that make it really portable. The idea is that the iconography contains both Greek crosses and Latin crosses. So one specialists say that this is to be ascribed to some Greek-speaking area in Sicily in the 12th century, so most likely the most important place in Sicily for the Greek community, which is the city of Messina, closer to the Calabria part of the mainland. And I want to reflect at this stage about the use of these situla for especially the mass conversion, something that we see in Agrigento, for instance, as well. This idea of having lots of Muslims being a bishop, priest, a Christian, living in an area in which you are a minority, and you have the order to start converting lots of, like, a vast amounts of population who are Muslims, and you need to do that in the open air. And I want to reflect on this idea of using this situla for conversion ceremonies of Muslims in particular. Okay, so that's it. I have conclusions, I think, there, but it's less important. Thank you so much, and any thoughts, just let me know, and feel free to get in touch after today. We'd love to hear from you. So, thank you.